Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create a Northern Lights card using two easy die marker techniques. You're going to love them. They're so easy and it gives you another way to use those die markers. I'm using the Greatest Treasure stamp set from Pajama Crafter stamps, specifically the dragon and the little dragon, as well as one of the sentiments. I'm going to start up with creating my background because we need to give it a lot of time to dry. I'm using some mixed media Heavystock here. Any mixed media cardstock will work, and I'm using some die markers. So I've got some Karin markers here. Any die-based markers would work, and if you don't have any die-based markers, another option is some die ink pads, like distress pads. They will work. You can just put some of that ink on the background of your mixed media Heavystock. I want to create a bit of a Northern Lights look here, so I'm using colors for that. You could also alter them and create kind of a galaxy look, just changing up the way your markers are on the page. However, once we spray this with water, it's going to move. The ink is going to move. Now, I like to spray my surface before spraying my mixed media or putting my mixed media Heavystock on there. It kind of suctions it into place and prevents the cardstock from rolling and keeps it nice and flat. So your dyes or your inks will stay close to where they are supposed to be or where you've put them while they're drying. And that works because we've wet both sides of that cardstock. Typically, if you put the cardstock down and put the spray on one side, it curls because one side is wet, one side is not. By wetting both sides, you eliminate that. Here is the final result. It has dried for several hours. I want to make sure that it's completely dry before moving on. Often, if I want to do a background like this, I will do it in the evening and let it dry completely overnight so that it's completely dry before we want to move on and work. I haven't used this stamp set before, so first thing I'm going to do is use a white eraser on the stamping surface and remove any possible manufacturing residue, and then I'm going to use a brush to remove any eraser bits there. This only needs to be one time, and I just do the entire set so that I know next time I go to use this set, it has been done. I don't need to do this. For the next step, I'm using some watercolor cardstock. I'm using distress watercolor cardstock. Any watercolor will do. I like the distress because it's nice bright white, but it doesn't really matter what watercolor cardstock you use. This is just my favorite. I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that I can stamp my little dragons a couple times. I've used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock, and then I'm stamping it a couple times to make sure I've got a nice crisp image. When you're using watercolor cardstock, one side is typically textured and the back side is typically, there's usually some texture, but a little bit less. I use the back side. I use the side that is less textured, especially when I'm stamping images, because I want to make sure to get as crisp of an image. So once I take that out of my Misti tool, I'm using some gold embossing powder and I'm heat embossing that image. I want to watercolor these little dragons with those die markers, and I typically like to heat emboss for watercolor because not only does it give the edges of that image a ridge for the watercolor to stay in, but it also adds a different texture. Watercolor is often flat in my opinion, so by adding that heat embossing, it adds a little bit of extra texture to it, a little bit of a different finish. For my background, while I'm watercoloring, I want this to dry. I'm using some watercolor mixing sets. This is a gold color. I just put some water in it and use a brush to mix that water into that gold paper and then flicked it, splattered it on the background. Another option there is a gold ink pad, or if you have gold splatter, that would work as well. The sparkle accents from Spellbinders would work as well. I'm going to use those die markers as my colors for watercoloring, and I'm choosing the same colors that I chose for my background. So I'm using the pink here, which is cerise, and I'm using violet blue for my large dragon. For the smaller one, I'm using cyan and I'm using grass. The only other two colors that I used on my background that I'm not using here is royal blue and black. And again, those colors could change depending on the look that you're going for. Also choose completely different colors for watercoloring your dragon. I'm using my surface here as a palette. I have a Tim Holtz Media Mat on my surface, so I'm just scribbling the marker on there and using that as a palette to pick up that color and then watercolor it onto my dragon. And for the larger one, I'm using the purple on the back or the top, and then I'm using the pink for the belly and the bottom part of the wings. You could easily swap those two colors. When you see them on my background, after it's completely done on the background, I think the larger dragon would be a little bit more, or a little stand out a little bit more if the pink was on the back and the purple was on the belly, just the way the colors were on that background. but again, you could choose completely different colors if you wanted as well. Now I'm using my surface here that I'm working on as my palette. You could also use like a recycled sour cream lid, a plate, an old acrylic block, that type of thing. That would work here as well. The watercolor brush I'm using has water in the handle. So what you can't see here on the bottom right, I have a piece of paper towel, and I'll regularly use that to take excess color off of my brush or to squeeze the body or the belly of that brush to flush water through my brush so that I can clean it off for the next color. I like this type of brush because I don't need to have a jar of water sitting on my desk, and I tend to be quite a klutz, so it's really handy for me not to have a jar of water sitting there that I could possibly spill, because I likely would. Now, once I have my dragons here watercolored, I'm going to let them completely dry before I fussy cut them. But before we get to that point, I want the dragons to look like they have some pearly scales on them. So I'm using some Perfect Pearls here. This is a mica powder that has a binding agent in it that is activated by water. So as soon as I mix water with it, it can be used as a pearly paint. So I'm going to put it on the spines or the ridges of the wings of the dragon, and then on the back and a little bit up the arms and the legs. I'm going to be just using my brush to dot it on there. We're still going to see the color underneath there, but it's going to add some pearly dots to that background just to give it a bit of a scaly look, to make it look like it has a little bit more texture. Again, I find sometimes with watercolors that it can look a little bit flat, so I always like to find different ways to add extra texture to them, and this is one of the ways that I like to do it. You could also, if you want, just watercolor over the whole thing with that Perfect Pearls. It would mute the colors a little bit, but it would make the entire dragon have that pearly finish to it. But by just dotting it, you still get that texture from the pearly finish. You also get the texture from those dots. So I let them dry completely, and then I'm using my detail scissors in order to fussy cut around them. I'm just going right outside that embossed edge, and I do like to slant my scissors in so that it's kind of cutting at a bit of a curve. I also will typically have the scissors in my right hand because I'm right-handed, and use my left hand to move that paper around. My scissors, the angle of them doesn't move a whole lot. I'm not completely moving my wrist on my right hand to get around that image. I'm moving that paper to go or to line up with the blade of my scissors. So off screen, I did the rest of that dragon, so we're ready to go. My background is completely dried, so I can cut it down and start creating my card. So I'm trimming this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I want to trim down as little as possible. I'm going to do a little thin mat around it. So my mat here is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And I'm using a gold ink pad to just swipe around the edges to give it a gold mat around that image. This is going to tie in with that gold embossing as well as the gold splatter we have on our background. And this particular pad would also work for creating those splatters if you wanted to as well. It is a water soluble ink, so it would work to do those splatters. So with my background and my dragons ready, I want to add my sentiment to the front or to my background. So I'm going to use the sentiment stamp from The Greatest Treasure. It says, "Mom, you're my greatest treasure." I am doing this card before Mother's Day, but it's going to be posted after Mother's Day, so I don't really want it to be a Mother's Day card. You could certainly create it as one for next year. So I am not going to stamp, or I'm not going to heat emboss the mum part of that sentiment. When I first put my ink on, of course, I put the ink right over the whole thing, but I'm going to rub that ink off. If any of that embossing powder gets on any remaining ink that is on the word mum, I'm just going to brush it off so that all of my card says is, "You're my greatest treasure." So it can be used for a lot more occasions than just Mother's Day. So I did use some embossing powder tool on that background. I stamped with VersaMark ink, poured that embossing powder on there, rubbed any powder off or brushed any powder off that wasn't where I wanted it to be, and then I'm heat embossing it. When you first pour that powder on there, it doesn't really show up on the background, but once you heat emboss it, it brightens it up and it coordinates beautifully with the gold embossing around the dragons, as well as that gold mat and the gold splatter that we have on our background. It all ties in. So I have an A2 card base here. I'm going to glue my mat on first, and then I'm going to glue my background. I'm just using my Barely Art glue in that fine line bottle. I use this to glue most things in place. I love a liquid glue because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place, and then it is stuck for good. Then I can put that glue on the back of my dragons. Another option here would be to use some foam pop dots if you wanted them to pop up off the background a little bit. But because we have so much going on here, I figured I would just glue them flat to that background, but that is another option. I'm going to add those dragons to the background, and then if that isn't enough, you could easily leave it right here. I decided to add just a little bit more texture to those dragons. So I took my glossy accents, and I'm just going to add dots on the dragon. I'm going to put a little bit on the spine of, or the spines, I guess, of the wings, and then just dots of different sizes right where I put those perfect pearl dots. But I want these to combine. I'm not putting them right on top of where I put those perfect pearl dots. I'm just adding extra texture to it. So glossy accents, just going to add that domed glossy dimension and give it some physical texture to it. I'm also going to add a little bit on the wings. You can see me wiping the end of my glossy accents because I'm getting towards the end of my bottle, so it's flowing a lot quicker. So some of those dots are getting a little bit bigger than I want them to be. So after I've done this, I'm also going to use my handy tool set, especially the die pick part. I'm just going to go in those larger dots of glossy accents, take some glossy accents that are there and make some smaller dots, and I'll have a little bit more control with this tool. Another option, if that is just too small, that a die pick is too small, you could also use a stylus. They come in many different sizes, and then again, you can have a little bit more control over the different sizes of dots you put on there. But I do think it looks best when there are a variety of sizes. We don't want to have all the exact same size on there because then it starts to look like polka dots rather than scales or bumps on the back of the dragon. The last step here, I'm going to add some glossy accents on the horns just to make them nice and glossy, and again, just give it a little bit of extra texture, and then use that die pick in order to smooth it out, neaten it up a little bit, and go all the way to the tip of the horn. I'm going to do that on the little baby dragon as well. Now, I chose to put both dragons on here, but you could even just do one. If you just wanted a single dragon, they're touching at the nose, but they could easily be cut apart if you wanted them to be. Here is the final card. I just love that background with those dragons, and I love all the extra texture on those dragons as well. You can find all of the supplies that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.